Measly brains. We thank you for the words that you will be speaking to us through these words and through the words of others, and help you to help us to open up our hearts so that the seed can be planted in ourselves. We thank you again for this day, and we hope that everything happens in your will today, Father. Thank you. Amen.
Jesus' name. Did time out?
No, I'm okay.
Okay. Well, good morning. We're going to pick up in Deuteronomy. We're in chapter 24. So we're going to talk about divorce and some miscellaneous laws. So this should be interesting. So we'll talk a little more about this. As we know, this is Moses giving laws again so that they can succeed. And as we've studied with the rest of Deuteronomy, there's blessings and curses, right? So God gives us free will. He's a gentleman. And sometimes we can choose a different path, but there's consequences of that. And we'll see that here this week again in our study. So I don't have a great background because Chris isn't here to give us all the great history. But let's go ahead and go forward. Verses 1 through 4. Who would like to read?
When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some uncleanness in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house, when she has departed from his house and goes and becomes another man's wife. If the latter husband detests her and writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her as his wife, then her former husband who divorced her must not take her back to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God has given you as an inheritance.
Wow.
So I have to jump in. Oh my gosh. So my mom was just in town, and she was down from Colorado. She is divorced to my dad. My dad has a new wife who is she's demonic, for lack of a better word. She really, quite literally is demonic. Anyways, my mom was saying, we just had this conversation. My mom's like, well, you know, if she ever dies or anything ever happens to her, hopefully, you know, your father will just take me back and we can go back to our marriage. Like, I just had this conversation. And and even I was like, oh, well, you know, I don't know. But literally just had that exact conversation.
Wow.
How weird.
Yeah. Well, my mom's been remarried multiple times to the same man, so I totally get this. Definitely not God's will, definitely not the way things should work. But let me see if I can explain this a little bit, because it's a little confusing the way it's put here. Once again, if we go forward to Matthew, it explains that it was the hardness of their heart is the reason Moses allowed them to give certificates of divorce. It was never God's will for divorce. That's clear. You know, we go all the way back to Genesis, right? Let no man separate what God has put together. And the marriage should be a covenant, right? And it's supposed to be a picture of Jesus and the church. So it's supposed to be a forever type thing, at least, you know, until we get to heaven, right? Just to make a difference there for the Mormons that might be listening. So, because the Bible's clear, we don't have marriage in heaven, because our bride is Jesus, not some other person. Now, back to here this is kind of what we talked about. This is free will, right? So God is allowing free will, and then they issued the divorce certificate, and I think McGee had said in another commentary, which I thought was pretty appropriate, he said that it had become so commonplace that, you know, the wife could literally burn biscuits and write a divorce certificate. So you can see how once you open the door on this, then it becomes too much. And now all of a sudden, just from gathering here, you can see that the practice had probably gotten so bad that they burn the biscuits. This girl looks better, write her a certificate. We'll take this one. This one does biscuits even worse, and it wasn't as good as it. And I want my old one back. And then they're no different than the pagans at this point, right?
No different than today's society.
Absolutely. We have a no-fault divorce in our state, which I have a friend that's really active in that goes and he actually reports judges in the family court system and exposes it because so many parents lose their rights to their children.
What is it?
It's called no-fault divorce, but essentially you can get a divorce in most states right now for no reason. You can just, yeah, just kind of like what this says, you know, didn't find favor anymore, you know, and go ahead.
Well, the very first sentence talks about the qualification for that first marriage to go undone is if he finds uncleanness in her. My question is, what would that be?
That's what I want.
Yeah, I don't know that the commentaries got into that too deep, and unfortunately you don't have Chris here to probably explain that more deeply. But I will tell you that, you know, when we go forward into the New Testament, Paul talks about this. So there was more clarity given in the New Testament, and in the New Testament there's really only two cases where divorce is allowed. You know, one is obviously infidelity. Okay, so if the marriage covenant, the vows have been broken due to infidelity, then divorce is allowed. It's not prescribed, but it's allowed because the covenant has been broken, right? I will tell you that, you know, a lot of studies just show that people that get a divorce, a lot of them are not happy. You know, like they thought it was worse than, a lot of them have regrets. They should have tried harder. They should have, you know, made it work. The second case is a little more sticky. So the second case is when you marry someone that's unequally yoked, right? So they're not a believer. So you didn't follow God's rules to begin with, okay? Otherwise you wouldn't have put yourself in that situation. But now that you're in that situation, you're supposed to do your best in that marriage. And you're supposed to live your life such that the other person will see the change in you, and see God in you, and be drawn to the goodness and want to convert. Okay? But if you, hello, come on in. The water's warm. So if you do find that yourself in that situation where it's a divorce between people where one's the believer, the exception where God allows that according to Paul is if the non-believing spouse leaves. You don't kick them out, you're the faithful partner, but the non-believing spouse leaves and then stops support and doesn't come back, then you're allowed divorce. So those are the two New Testament things. I have two hands. And I did that by memory, so I could be slightly off.
My guess to my answer to my own question is that the very first marriage, the husband finds out because there's no physical evidence that the woman is a virgin.
probably, because we have covered that before, so that would be biblical, but go ahead.
On the New Testament one, I disagree with your point of view. Just me. They were pagans before they accepted Christ. They didn't know about Jesus Christ until Paul came and preached the word. So they were probably married before, pagan, no problem. One becomes a believer, then there's a problem.
Right.
And that the spouse chooses to leave, yes, divorce. But if they were pagan before they heard about Christ, they were equally yoked. The yoke changed when somebody became a believer within.
One of them converted.
Yes,
But this is Israel.
I know in here, but
In Deuteronomy, it's Israel.
you're right. But his reference to the New Testament.
Yeah, the New Testament verse, yeah, but we all know couples that were both, didn't have a relationship with the Lord, and then one gets a relationship, and now all of a sudden there's conflict. And I have a really good friend that struggled with that, because he's on fire, he's kind of a Jesus freak. Wife, not so much, right? And he struggled with it for years, and then finally he just let his wife kind of do his own thing and stop pressuring her. And now all of a sudden she's wanting to go to church, and she's wanting. So it's one of those things like you gotta tap the brakes on, you know, and let them see the change in you, and then they'll want that, you know.
What about abuse?
Well, abuse, I would say that the husband is not being faithful and probably broke the vow. That's my opinion. I mean, the standard for the husband is, we could get into this, but I mean, the problem, almost all women hate that verse about submit to your husbands, right? Which I agree, and a lot of people take that out of context. But they also don't read the verse right before it, which is, husbands, love your wife like Christ loved the church and died for the church. So if you love your wife like Christ loves the church, and you're willing to die for her, then submission is not a problem. And what happens is, most of the men that are wagging their finger about submission aren't doing the first part. That's Cody's opinion, right? Because if you're doing the first part, then the other part's easy. Go ahead.
Well, submission is the theme song of every Christian relationship.
Right. I mean, the wife can't submit to your leadership as a man unless you're submitted to the authority of Christ. So it goes down, and you know, they're equal. You know, it was taken from the rib for a reason. They didn't take the foot bone to make Eve, right? So they took it for here, and we're supposed to be helpmates. We're supposed to be partners in this. There are certain things that Heather does a ton better, a lot of things. And there are certain things that I do better, right? You know.
I guess you would say we're in marriage, we have equal responsibilities to one another, just different responsibilities.
Yeah, in my opinion, I would explain it kind of like the church, right? So in the church, there's feet, and there's eyes, and there's all the body parts, right? In a marriage, he puts us together like that. So you have skills that Jeremiah doesn't, and Jeremiah has skills that you don't. But when you put it together, it works, right? So if I try to multitask or do anything creative or arts or bake, it would be a flipping disaster, right? Because my wife excels at all those things. But give her an algebra problem and it's a disaster, right? So, go ahead.
It's biology too, because men have quick twitch fibers, even if they've chopped off their body parts. And they have a lot more power for lifting.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
It's in every muscle.
Yeah. Well, we found that out. You know, all you have to do is talk about UFC or one of those matches where they allowed the man to fight the woman, and they ended up with a fractured skull, right? So now that's outlawed, right? They should have just followed the rules to begin with. So, one other thing here, you know, and I'll leave it at that, but this gets to where we, as we the people, have kind of abdicated our responsibilities.
Mhm.
The marriage is an institution of God. It's a covenant. So the relationship, if you draw a pyramid, right, it's Heather and I, and then both of us up to God. And if we keep God at the center, then this whole thing works, right? So think of that illustration. Now let's take the state. So the state now, and I can speak to Texas, the state has a marriage license. So now what they have done is they've taken this model, right, and they adapted it over here to the state. So now, according to the state of Texas, you have a contract going up to the state, and then you both are co-contractors with a dotted line, not even legally. It's not even a solid line, it's dotted. And then even after divorce, the state still has responsibilities as part of that contract. And oh, by the way, they have access to the kids and everything there. And that was never intended, right? So like, I was kind of thinking about this because many of y'all know that we adopted 4 children, and 2 of them came from, you know, a rough background, you know, hard places. And I have never had an incident with CPS. Never. And yet I know for a fact that one of my child has made all kinds of false allegations. But Heather and I got married in Jamaica. And Jamaica is one of those countries that has reciprocal on and off U.S. rights. And I guess maybe God's fortune or design is we were told it was reciprocal, and apparently it wasn't. So Heather and I are married, but if you look it up in the state of Texas, there's no marriage license on record because our license is in Jamaica.
That's a miracle.
Right. So they probably called CPS, and CPS had no right.
Wow.
You know, I don't know that for a fact, but
That's only good because they're false accusations.
yeah, I don't know. It may be speculation on my part. Maybe most people didn't believe they were false allegations.
Yeah.
Never bothered to follow up. But let's go on to any other questions before we go on? Okay, verse 5.
When a man has taken a new wife, he shall not go out to war or be charged with any business. He shall be free at home 1 year and bring happiness to his wife, whom he has taken.
Okay, so think about this logically from the Lord's perspective. He's taking them in to the promised land where they're going to have to fight giants. There's going to be fierce fighting. He wants his fighting men committed. And so why do you think this is a good thing?
Start a family. I mean, the verse, staying home for a year, I was reading a little bit about the commentary, but yes, starting a family, because if he were to go off to war, just like it says, if he were to go off to war and be killed, his line would be over.
Right. Go ahead.
I think a guy still in a honeymoon mode wouldn't make a good soldier.
Yeah,
To
true.
be a coward, would put his foot forward whenever he needs to. He would always be looking backwards.
Wouldn't you be kind of depressed, right? I mean, you just get married, you don't even have any time to settle. You're worried about your wife because she doesn't have a home. you haven't got her settled. Now all of a sudden you get her settled, you've got a kid on the ground, you need to come back. You're gonna fight fierce for your family at that point, right? So to me, it sounds like a brilliant idea. I don't know why we don't do it now, right?
Yeah. There'd be so many widows and all the laws to honor that.
Well, and back in that culture, you know, you would have been taken care of, right?
Yeah.
So even if the guy died, the brother or something would make sure that the widow was taken care of. Redeemer.
Kind of a weird comment, but if the husband were home with a wife when that little baby arrived, I think the bonding between that baby and both parents would be better too.
Yeah, there's definitely some of that. I mean, when we got Hudson, I know it's an adoption, but we got Hudson, I was actually unemployed, so I spent 4 months with Hudson. Maybe that's why I probably messed him up. But I spent time with Hudson, and I was so bonded with him because Heather was working. And the only thing I know I screwed up was he never crawled because he was so strong and everything. And I said, oh, crawling's for sissies, you know. He just went straight to walking. So then he ended up having to have therapy for, I guess crawling is very important for your dexterity muscles. So he walked before a year old, but he recovered. Okay, verse 6.
No man shall take the lower or upper millstone in pledge, for he takes one's living in pledge.
Okay, so I put a long thing in here for you to read in your spare time, but this will kind of give you the cliff notes of this, but let me see if I can paraphrase this. For you to survive back in that time, we would have to, every family would have a mill of their own. So they would grind either the wheat or the corn to make meals so that they could have bread so that they could eat. And the very reason that they have this law must have meant that someone was taking the grind as a pledge and leaving the family with no food or no ability to grind their own so they could feed their family, which is pretty low, right? So a couple of takeaways on this is one, and this was a little convicting to me, but are you depriving anyone or participating in a company that deprives others of critical resources impacting their livelihood? So I thought of me, some of my banks, so sure, right? Some of their practices. Kind of convicting. Next, notice nutrition takes work. You have to take off the husks. If it's corn, you have to sift the wheat. You have to grind it. You have to do all that to make the bread of life. So from a different level, instead of the physical, the spiritual, are we doing that with the Word, right? Are you doing, like Richard said when he came in here, reading Leviticus? You know, some of this is a little rough, right? We got to strip it back. We got to understand what's the reason, what's the purpose, why would they, you know, to the point we can and apply it, right? And because we want those blessings and not those curses, right? Not those consequences of poor choices. Okay? Let's go on to verse 7.
If a man is found kidnapping any of his brethren of the children of Israel, and mistreats him or sells him, then that kidnapper shall die, and you shall put away the evil from among you. There's quite a few people in our country with human trafficking.
Yeah. I put in here, despite the problems we have with the corrupt justice system currently, I think I typoed there, what do you think the impact would be to society if everyone knew that kidnappers and those involved in slavery would be put to death swiftly
We would be so much safer.
and locally, right? Because God's justice is also local.
Yeah.
So if you do the crime in Bonham, you're prosecuted in Bonham, and you're prosecuted with people that know your neighbors. That was the intent. So here, all the way back to here, which the founding fathers quoted Deuteronomy a lot. We read that, but you know, when it says a jury of my peers, that means that if I'm on trial, that means they got somebody that goes to church with me, somebody that works with me, somebody that knows my character is on that jury, right?
Wasn't that Trump's argument in his trial, like, he wanted a different jury or something because he knew all of them were basically against him?
Yeah.
He knew that they were all leftists that were
Yeah.
going to convict him.
They weren't a jury of his peers.
Yeah, exactly, that he was requesting a jury of peers or
Yeah.
whatever,
It's
and
unconstitutional.
in today's society, like, oftentimes, especially the higher up you are, it's not a jury of peers.
Oh, no. Even locally, it's not anymore. I mean, the definition of peer is different, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Another interesting thing about location is if that person is being unjustly accused, there's a city for them to flee to.
Right. Yeah. But that city, we read about that on the City of Refuge, and those elders were, you know, they were held to a really high standard. So they had to totally investigate the manor, they had to, you know, all that, and then they had to swiftly carry out justice if he was guilty.
You know, this verse here, I'm thinking as a parent of young children, we're always keeping our eyes on our children everywhere we go. I was potentially, me and the 4 kids went down to Rockwall and we went to a hole-in-the-wall taco shop, just not realizing that wasn't really safe to do without Jeremiah with us. And we, I suspect we were being targeted for trafficking by 2 Hispanic men that were basically standing there doing it, staring me down and the kids, and I was staring them down, and the kids were in the van. It was scary, but anyways, you know, even when my kids go out to check the mail, I stand there and I watch them the entire time they are out there until they get back inside the gates. And I tell them, don't ever go out and talk to strangers in the road. If they're not our neighbors, don't talk to them. And like, that's the world we live in.
Yeah,
I
it's
mean,
sad, but true.
Yeah, like, we live in a world, like in the 80s, when I was a kid, it wasn't like that, not nearly as much. Like, we used to play in the roads of our neighborhoods, and I was allowed to bike around the entire neighborhood by myself, like without a parent, when I was 11 years old. I would never let my
Oh, I
children
know.
do that anymore.
If I had a
That's
dollar for every
insane.
time my parents told me to go play in the street,
Yeah.
you know, I'd be a rich man.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, we always went through that too. You knew where the party was because you saw all the bikes. You know, you just rode around the neighborhood until you saw all the bikes.
Yeah, but now human trafficking is so, it's everywhere, it's in every corner of
But-
everywhere.
But I will push back on that a little bit. That's our society.
Yeah.
Like if you go to China, they don't have an issue. Like there are reports in China that people will have like $1,000. You know, they're way into electronics. They'll have their brand new iPhone 16 and their iPad and all that. They'll put it on the dash with the windows down and park the car and just go inside.
Really?
And
Because they're
and
so strict?
you know, Americans will go, why would you do that? Somebody could steal that. And he goes, oh no, there's no way somebody will steal that. If someone sees someone besides us that has the key to open this door, reach it, there will be 10 Chinamen attack them
Oh, wow.
immediately because that's their culture that they built. And what do we have? We have a culture where women or children are hurt or beat all around us, and men aren't being men, and nothing is done, right? And we have a culture that prosecutes you if you get involved too, because
Yeah.
the jury is so
Yeah.
corrupt. But okay, let's go to I guess 8 and 9.
Take heed in an outbreak of leprosy that you carefully observe and do according to all that the priests, the Levites, shall teach you, just as I commanded them. So you shall be careful to do. Remember what the Lord your God did to Miriam on the way when you came out of Egypt.
So I thought it was appropriate that you read that. So yeah, the one of our healthcare professionals. So obviously, you know, the Lord had restrictions to keep his people safe from communicable diseases and that type of stuff and spreading. And we read this in the prior chapter, I think. You remember about even the military when they had to go to the latrine, they were supposed to get their shovel and, you know, all that, so they didn't have sickness in their camp. And the pagans didn't, they just went everywhere.
And some communities still do that. Like,
Yes.
there's still areas in the world, or mine makes reference often to people defecating in their drinking water source. And it's like God's word could still help people today with issues that it talks about.
Yeah, I mean, we just got back from Del Rio and the missionary place, you were there, but they have a septic system now, right? So the first time we went there, they didn't even have a septic system, you know, which was very unsanitary, right? And
Makes a big difference.
But the tap that they drink out of has parasites in it, so all the residents are getting medication to treat the parasites that they're getting from the water that they drink.
yeah, in Africa they call it Sunday because they take it every Sunday, and it's ivermectin, which is one of the best medicines in the world. But we delude ourselves and we think we don't have parasites and we're so clean, and we're full of them. Go ahead.
Part of the rabbinic dietary laws can also be helpful. And I'm not trying to brag, but the Seventh-day Adventists follow the dietary laws of the Old Testament, and their average lifespan is 10 years longer than the rest of the population.
Yeah, I've seen some specials on that. But I will say some of the strict Jewish dietary laws are a little crazy.
Don't mix meat with dairy.
Yeah, and the pots and the pans and the plates, and you have your dairy ones here.
Well, that's
and
not in
ones here.
scripture, that's in the Talmud, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Man's interpretation of what's scripture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we left off where we 10 and 13. 10 through 13.
When you lend your brother anything, you shall not go into his house to get his pledge. You shall stand outside, and the man to whom you lend shall bring the pledge out to you. And if the man is poor, you shall not keep his pledge overnight. You shall in any case return the pledge to him again when the sun goes down, that he may sleep in his own garment and bless you. And it shall be righteousness to you before the Lord your God.
Okay, so what you see here is that's God's dignity. It's God's will. We've had this conversation before, but every person, regardless of how demonic they are, every person is made in God's image. They're an image bearer. So we need to remember that, even though we may not like them. We need to remember that, and we need to treat human life with dignity, right? And that's what this is getting to. Now, it may not be, it kind of gives you a light to how poor a lot of these people were, that the only thing they could pledge was their cloak that they used to sleep in, okay? Because it would get cold at night. If you've ever been to the desert, you know how that is, right? It's blazing hot during the day, but you got to have something at night, right? And so they would take the cloak, and obviously some of these people were keeping the cloak overnight and letting the person shiver to death. So they had to institute this law because of the evil nature of man, right? Going back to Genesis 6, right? Thoughts of men are evil all the time, right? So what I thought about how this relates today is a lot of our mistreatment of the poor, especially like Section 8 housing And then I know the Haitian migrant thing in Ohio got a lot of play because it came up on the debate. And I just happened to see an article that lady is actually facing charges, and there's a $100,000 fine. So she actually did string up the neighbor's cat and eat the neighbor's cat. And you might have heard that because it was supposedly fake news, but now of course there's charges and it's in the court system and it was actually true. But normally if they tell you it's fake, that's normally the first sign that this could be true.
Yeah.
You could be onto something. If the fake comes out really quick,
Yeah.
if the fake is delayed, normally it's right. Like, so
Yeah.
there's a lot of, like there was this thing about,
Hunter's laptop.
well, yeah,
Fake
but,
news.
but like there was a photo op with Harris with a C-7, you know, big military plane.
C5, really.
Yeah, and they were loading it up for supplies for North Carolina.
Yeah.
And people were calling in saying this was staged, it was fake, and they had to unload it. And it turned out, yes, there was part of that, but it was taken out of context. They had to unload it because the plane had a mechanical problem, and then they reloaded it and actually did it. Okay, so it wasn't quite the whole truth. So there's ones on both sides, but in this particular instance, the thing that you might not have heard about the whole Haitian problem is there was 10,000 migrants sent to the city that had a population of about 30,000, maybe 40. So it's like 1 in 4, okay? Why would you do that? Great question. So let me answer it, because people have been doing digging on this. People have been doing digging on this. So apparently there are some large food plants that do meat processing nearby, and they make their workers work in like freezers where it's incredibly cold and it's incredibly hard work, and they have high turnover rates and they don't pay well. So then they brought this population in. Magically, they all have jobs here below market. Then the guy who owns these or has the majority interest, you know, they do LLCs and they protect themselves, right? So then you follow the trail, somebody did all the math. The guy that owns this also owns a van company and also owns like 500 rent houses. So what they've done is they put 20 migrants per house. They charge 100 times more the normal going rate for these illegals. Then they pay them below market wages so that he gets the money back that he paid them. And then they have a staffing agency so he can't be sued in between. And then they have a van company so they can make money charging them for the transportation to get to the work. So he's essentially taking all their money, and they're probably so hungry that they're eating cats like they do in Haiti, you know, and the geese in the pond and other stuff. And there's some spiritual implications for some of that in Haiti too, but we can't all put it on hunger. But
That's terrible.
yeah, but that's our world, right?
That was
It's
true
just-
in America back in 1880 through 1920.
Right.
As far as child labor laws, as well as the American worker and what they were tied to.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I don't buy Ben and Jerry's ice cream because they got prosecuted for the same thing with migrant children, putting them to work in their factories.
We only had a good spell for a pretty short period of time, if you think about it. Like, we only, because we're back in, you know, a really horrible world again. And the good spell only lasted a very short while, and then people got really apathetic, and here we go again. History repeats itself.
Well, God's lifted his hand because we kicked him out, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. 14 and 15.
you shall not oppress a hired servant who is poor and needy, whether one of your brethren or one of the aliens who live in the land within your gates. Each day you shall give him his wages and not let the sun go down on it, for he is poor and has set his heart on it, lest he cry out against you to the Lord, and it be sin to you.
You know, I was thinking about this. You know, if you've ever used day laborers, you know, they get paid daily like that. And our society, a lot of times, especially on the hourly, the low end, a lot of them get paid like bi-weekly, which is way too long. I mean, if they're trying to make it, that is way too long. I mean, weekly maybe. I can see the administrative headache of having to cut a check daily or something, but you know, I've got kids in college and kids, you know, they're young that are doing those low wage jobs. And, you know, I mean, if you're paid bi-weekly, they have to start a job and then they have to, you know, they go like 3 weeks without getting paid. And you're talking about a $10 an hour job. You know, they got to get gas in the truck and, you know, that kind of stuff. And it's hard for me, you know, to try to teach my children to be self-sufficient and not enable, but then again, even if they get a job, I got to cut. You understand? I mean, it's just not, it's not right. You know?
So something that I'm seeing a lot of now, so we're used to, especially in our country, you become 18, you go out to school, then you get a job, you have your own place, and that's how it's been for quite a while. But a lot of the friends that I have and their children who are like early to mid 20s, they're still living at home. They're working full time, but they're still living at home. And I'm starting to see this trend where families are building houses on the same plot of land, multi-generational things. So like in other countries, I mean, multi-generational families living together, very normal. Whereas here, it's always been, you become an adult, you go off to college, you get a job and live on your own.
It hasn't always been that way. That's,
right. No,
that's
I'm talking about
that
recent society.
Yeah. There's a difference. I mean, I'm all for the multi-generational, you know, but there's also a huge segment of the, quote, failure to launch syndrome, right? And, you know, trying to balance that, and you know, that's the hard part as a parent. And I know lots of, I'm not the only one, but I know lots of, you know, parents that are struggling with the older kids that aren't working,
that refuse
and they're
to
just
leave.
living in the basement and not working, not even working. You know,
Jeremiah,
I mean, they're not even trying.
Yeah.
Right? They're just, you know, go ahead.
I did a lot of home health with families like up against the Red River. The Keatons, Mr. Keaton used to own 5,000 acres. Well, it's divided up now, and there's another family way on the other side of Sherman that I worked with, and you know, used to have wells in their artesian wells even, and their whole property is like, all the family lives on a different plot of land. But I mean, I think that's been here for a while. I mean, those families have been here they're almost tribal in their attitude.
Yeah, well, there's actually, you kind of mentioned it before, but there's a certain elite people that they actually almost intermarry. There's
Like
actually a genealogy, well, not just that. I mean, like the Rothschilds, that level.
Yeah.
But there's actually, you know, a genealogical study that was done for the Caesarian community, and they're finding that they have mental illness and other stuff because they've so tightly controlled their marriage, their bloodlines. It's like the tree doesn't branch enough. You know, you've married too many first cousins. You know, and so
consequences.
yeah, free will consequences, right? So they're trying to control their wealth, and they're trying to, you know, and God says, you know, fine,
Control
you got
it
free
too much.
will.
There you
Not
go.
breed yourself.
Yeah. So, okay. Let's go on to 16.
Father, Fathers shall not be put to death for their children, nor shall children be put to death for their fathers. A person shall be put to death for his own sin.
God is all about justice. And sometimes we look around and we don't see it, but I assure you it's coming. It's coming. You know, I mean, I look at my property and the holes from the drought are just everywhere, you know. I'm praying for rain, and at this point I'm like, okay, God, just at least let it rain on us, you know, like Goshen, right? Goshen was protected, and the others, because you know judgment is coming, you know, so. Let's go 17 through 22.
But rain is coming this week.
Or so they say.
Yeah, well, it's an election, it has to
Maybe on
rain.
Halloween.
50-50 chance of it happening.
Well, God has the
Right
right
now
to
I'm
hold
hoping that it's past Tuesday, or at least Tuesday evening, because not to get crappy on y'all, but I have a sewer line issue, and there's a hole that is about 6 foot deep dug under my house for them to fix it.
Don't wanna get
And
offended.
I have it now. I now have, after one solid week of Heather and I having no indoor plumbing, which was lots of fun. I highly recommend it on your marriage. But we now have indoor plumbing, but we still have a 6 foot hole that it would be nice if it was patched before the rain came. But go ahead.
You shall not pervert justice, do the stranger or the fatherless, nor take a widow's garment as a pledge. But you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore I command you to do this thing. When you reap your harvest in your field, and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over the boughs again. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you shall not glean it afterwards. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. And you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore I command you to do this thing.
So God here is reminding them that they need to be empathetic. And then you notice God's social welfare program compared to ours, right? Did you notice that they're not to, and you get into other passages and it'll essentially tell them not to do the corners of the field, right? So if you're, modern day analogy, but they would have done it with an ox, but modern day analogy, you're driving the tractor, you just turn and do a circular turn and leave the corner instead of doing the very edges, right? And they would do that. And then it was known in their culture that if you were hungry, you go to the fields and you snap off the grain and you put it just like Ruth did, right? And Ruth was the model of that, right? So kind of like us, Ruth is a picture of us, right? She wasn't Jewish, but she found the Lord God, and then she followed Naomi, and then she did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and took care of Naomi, a widow, and her being a widow herself, and was gathering in the fields using this very thing when Boaz spotted her, ogled her, I'm sure, and when Boaz spotted her, and Boaz is the kinsman redeemer, right? And redeemed her. And Boaz is kind of a picture of Christ, Jesus, because we were redeemed. We weren't Jewish. We were grafted in. And Boaz redeemed her. And now she went from being a widow, foreign country, pagan land, to being in the line of Jesus. Right. So, questions, thoughts, comments? Nope. Okay. I guess you're going to wrap up a few minutes early. record time.